Chair. Right, how to begin? Guy has a rather bizarre notion of when we go into states that are seeking democracy and help them. We say we do not go into states that are making progress towards a democratic mandate, or where it's clear that the democratic mandate is what the people currently support, whether or not their constitutional system of government is in and of itself democratic. We want to draw a clear line in this debate between, for instance, Singapore and, on the other hand, Iraq. And we think that that's something the proposition have systematically failed to do. We say it's a tautology that we should not invade a state where the democratic mandate, pulled or otherwise, is clearly one in which we should not enter that nation, irrespective of what else is occurring. Now, I'm going to bring you two main points. My first point is going to be the moral obligation for democratic change when the populace desires democratic change. My second point is going to be how organic change in dictatorial scenarios has been proven a failure, and why then we must act in other capacities. Before I do, we have a bit of rebuttal. We frankly reject the notion on the opposition bench that Iraq has been anything other than a resounding success. We understand that there are still failures within the Iraqi state. We say what isn't happening now is that entire villages of Kurds are being gassed. Women and children dying and buried in large pits. We say, as an international community, that is the sort of thing that we cannot allow to continue, and where in that case there was a clear call for change in that nation, where there were clear opposition to Saddam Hussein, that's an example of where we say we have to go in because that democratic change was called for. Then they talked about how it demonizes us. We say Guy is extrapolating from an extreme minority of the population in any given country and claiming those views are held by the vast majority of other inhabitants. Here we look at Afghanistan. We say the vast majority of the Afghani people want us continuing our work in the Helmand province. We say anywhere we go, there are a few wackos that think that our governments should basically leave and never show up again. We say the same is true in Georgia and Idaho in the US. We think that wherever you go, there will be a few nutjobs who do not like the work of propagating democracy. However, we do not see that as a valid reason for not continuing our efforts. We say fundamentally relations between the three groups in Iraq have improved since Saddam Hussein has been taken out of power. We say this is particularly true of the Kurdish population, who for the first time in generation upon generation is given the right to follow their own language, traditions and laws, and has some sort of democratic mandate for themselves, as opposed to being gassed and buried in a pit. No thank you. Right, so why do we have a moral obligation for democratic change? First and foremost, we say that in the majority of these nations, it is our mess. We say that we were imperial aggressors. When we were imperial aggressors, we drew straight lines on the map. The reason we did this was that some idiot in Whitehall, probably graduated from Durham, but we'll gloss over that, thought it was a good idea at the time. We say these lines didn't adequately take into account things like tribal lines or other ethnic divisions. They didn't take into account religious lines, things that are important to the populations in place. Now we know better, ladies and gentlemen. Our society has progressed to an extent where we can help these individuals and try and undo the damage we once did. We think it is a good thing that the Kurds now have a degree of autonomy. We think it is a good thing that three disparate nations within the Iraqi province can form a form of republic where they all come together and necessarily have to talk amongst themselves, necessarily have to find common ground.
So we clearly don't know better. Yes, you may bring up examples of where people are glad that we are still there, but we can bring up even more examples which we never came in the first place.
Thank you. No, we flatly reject that. I mean, once again, he is talking about small chunks of a population. We think, and yes, they tend to be the vocal minority. We think that the easy way out for the judging panel is to buy their hype and their rhetoric. We think that in most of these cases, the vast majority of a populace is pleased, for instance, that their dictator has gone. We saw the upswing of popular support that Saddam had left was tremendous. Now the problem then was getting all the parties to sit down and form an active democracy. Yes. We say this is a different problem. However, we say it's something that never would have occurred had Saddam still been in power. And here's the distinction. Now they have to meet. The disparate, eccentric, and rather crazy groups on the fringe necessarily have to form compromise in a parliamentary system. We think that's how you enact change, is through parliamentarianism and the force of going into government together. So how has organic change been proven false? Now, Saddam Hussein is an excellent example of this, actually, so we're going to carry on for a short period of time. Right, we say that the Iraqi people were not able to form democratic change because we say they didn't control a monopoly of power. Now, this is a difference between having a monopoly in terms of the number of people who wish Saddam were gone and the monopoly of power in terms of how they could enact that change. So what did the UN do? The UN, for years and decades, said, let's give sanctions against Saddam. I think even the proposition would agree those sanctions singularly failed to enact change within that government. Now, what did work? When we went in, we very quickly and incisively were able to take down Saddam. We were able to give individuals that democratic freedom. Now, whether or not those individuals embrace that democratic freedom as readily as we would have liked is a matter for another debate. The point is that the majority of citizens in Iraq are better off now than they were under Saddam's rule. And that's something Proposition has yet to talk about. Now, this is equally clear in Afghanistan. I, like the rest of you, was a big fan of the independent film Afghan Star. Now, I think that was a perfect example of how the average Afghani citizen was very supportive of Western change. Now, the individuals who are supportive of democracy and who are supportive of Western change aren't necessarily going to be less vocal. Why? You don't go and blow yourself up because you're supportive of democratic change. We think that just doesn't happen. We think it's very easy for the news to show people blowing themselves up because they hate what we've done, but very hard to show all those people going to the polls as the force for good that we accept has occurred. We also think a better example even than that perhaps is the NATO incursions into Europe. We say that, for instance, Southeast Europe is much more stable than it was prior to the NATO incursions. We've managed to bring an area of democracy that didn't exist prior to that intervention. We think Proposition has mislabeled this. We think Proposition is speaking of wrongs that have not occurred, and for those reasons we urge you to oppose.